Hi. Good evening. I am so incredibly glad you guys are all here. We have been working on the backside of this for a couple months now. We've been working on this for 3+ years since COVID. We have a lot of people behind the scenes helping us today, making sure that all of these parts and pieces go off well. So when the technology inevitably falls apart, Sydney is here to help take over hosting duties for like the 30 seconds it takes me to reboot some software on my computer. But that's besides the point. I guess, first of all, I just have to say thank you for being here. This is a lot of work to put together, and we have a lot of people who have been very generous with their time helping us get this stuff off the ground. But these are also our first foray into really focusing on making sure that the people who attend, the people that are a part of our community online, don't have to be limited to the people that live down the street from us. So we started as a small meetup community in Northern Michigan, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be available to many other people throughout the world. So part of this is being available to you in the audience here. We're going to have this available as coursework online, and we're going to be bringing our challenges back and adding them to our photo walks so that you have something fun to do with us, even if you can't physically attend with us. So the idea would be we're going out hiking on March 21st. We're going to go hike the dunes. If there's something that you can do in your community like that and you want to be a part of us virtually, if you will, go for a hike. Talk about or think about the similar things that we're sharing. We'll be putting, information out about what our topics are for the event. But that's a holistic approach to bringing our online community and our physical face-to-face community together so that we are one and the same regardless of where we live. So this is a big first step, and we really appreciate you guys being here. So follow along. Tonight we are going over Camera 101 Basics. This is all of the major operations of the camera. And by all, I just mean like the three main points that you need to understand in order to make sure that you have the correct exposure for your camera. We will be doing a Camera 102 course, which will be more a deeper dive into how those operations work and maybe some of the deeper settings, autofocus settings, aperture priority, shutter speed priority, all of those like fine details. But this course is going to be explicitly based around shutter speed, aperture, and ISO, and making sure that you understand how those three work together in order to create a good exposure. So these are what we're talking about when we say basic camera operations: shutter speed, aperture, and ISO. Those three things coming together to create a really solid exposure. Okay, we're going to start with something silly. What is a camera? This sounds dumb. This sounds like an obvious question, but first of all, if you're here because you've never actually seen a camera before, so that's what a camera looks like. Welcome to the planet Earth. Why are we talking about something so basic? First and foremost, the idea of a camera is actually something that comes to us from prehistory. The first camera that we know of is what is called a camera obscura. So camera obscura was essentially a dark room, say a house or a hut of some kind, with a tiny pinprick in the wall, by accident probably. So that light came from outside through that lens, and it was actually cast on the wall on the inside of that house. So we think of this house, this room, as a dark chamber, which is essentially what camera obscura means, darkened chamber. So we are thinking about our photography as light passing from outside through a lens and into this house, into this dark chamber. In our case, onto some sort of recording material, whether it's film or the sensor in a digital camera. So on a modern camera, what that looks like is the light comes from outside, hits this lens, and it bends and shapes the light as it passes through the lens and into the darkened chamber in the back of the camera. In there, we have a sensor which records that light that enters through the camera. So we need to understand how to control the quantity and the quality of that light as it passes through all of those components into our dark chamber in the back of our camera. So how do we do that? Okay, so as I alluded to before, there are three basic control mechanisms for your camera. The three operations of a camera are aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. We need to understand all three of them, and we need to understand how the three relate to each other. But there's something we need to talk about first. For each one of these settings, there's two operations. There is the quantity of light, and we have to control how much of that comes in. That's like the functional control of the light that enters our camera. And then there's a second one, which is the creative control. That is giving us permission to play with these things and mess around with them in a way that feeds the creative beast inside of us. So as we're thinking about all three of these settings, we're going to break each one down in functional, technical control, and then also the creative functions that feature allows us to play with. So let's dig in. Step 1, aperture. What is an aperture? So, on the front of a lens of a camera, we have an aperture. It's in two places, really. One is, you can't really see it here. Let me see if I can do it on this one. I don't think so. But as you adjust the aperture, you would see, can you see it? Yeah. There it is. There it is. So this diaphragm opens and closes to make a big hole or a little hole. The other place we have it is on my forearm. But, most people don't walk around with camera diagrams all over them. So you don't have that. You probably don't have that. But if we're talking about aperture, they come in many sizes. We've got a tiny little pinprick of a hole. We've got medium-sized holes. And we've got big holes. And as we are dialing our aperture back and forth, we need to play with, is that hole tiny or is that hole really large? And that does two things, just like everything else. One is it controls the quantity of light. This tiny little hole is only going to let a small fraction of the possible light that could enter through your lens. So as you're shrinking that hole down, you're blocking some of the light that comes through. As it gets bigger, more and more light is allowed to enter into the dark chamber in the back of our camera. So a small hole might be like f16. A medium-sized hole might be like f5.6. And a really large one might be f1.4. We're not going to get into the physics of why these numbers are backwards, but just trust me, they are. F16, it's a big number, and it means a small hole. And F1.4 or 1.2 or F1, that is a bigger hole. It's backwards, it's confusing, but when we get into like 102, we can probably go over why that makes sense. So again, we're playing with how much light we're letting enter into the camera, and this, as we open this hole up, it allows more light to come in. So in a lower light situation, the reception of a dance hall, a dark church or something like that, opening that hole up is going to give us more light to play with. On the creative side, this smaller hole, as that hole shrinks down, it's also focusing and tightening the light as it enters into the lens. So that means you're going to get a sharper image across the whole frame. And as you open that wider aperture up, it's going to allow for like more softness. So what that means is what we call depth of field. So as you're looking at me, say this is my camera over here. If I have a really, really narrow depth of field, I might have my eye in focus and my nose and my nose and the back of my head out of focus. So that's a shallow depth of field. If I open that, so if I shrink down that diaphragm and close that aperture and make a small pinprick, that might mean the front of my nose is in focus, my eyeball is in focus, the back of my head, and maybe even the mountain range behind me is in focus. So having that whole broad depth of field might be really important to your photo, or having that shrink down, having that narrow band of focus might be important to your creative control. So let's take a look at some options. Okay. So this is part of the PDF guide that I will be putting out with this. Partially it's my notes, partially it's just some examples, and there's some worksheets in here as well. So make sure your email is in, make sure you've signed up for the email so you can receive this when we're done. So this is a really good example of this whole page is broad depth of field, or bigger f-stop numbers that are going to give us that longer focus, that broad depth of field. So this example right here, f4, taking pictures on a road. I want to be able to see the focus on the trees and the foreground and this whole line. I don't want it to be interrupted by any sort of banding of focus. So if I were to shrink this or drop this aperture down to like f1.4 or 1.2 or something, I would see the point where I focused would be in focus, and then the back and the foreground would be out of focus. That can be a cool creative effect, but for this, we want to see that whole broad field front to back in focus. Same with something like this, where we have the texture of the trees is really pleasant, but we also want to see the clouds up here in focus as well. Same here. And up here, this is a really good example of when doing portrait work or event work, why you would want to use a broader depth of field. If I were to shoot this at 1.4 and I got Micah's face in focus here, this entire front row would be out of focus. Now you'll notice that I've also got the background back here is fairly sharp focus. You can kind of see the things in the background. If this was at 1.2 or 2.8, you would not see those, and that's less distracting, but you're pushing and pulling, playing with the balance between, do I want to see all of the people? Am I also okay kind of seeing the background as well? So then for contrast, this is a shallow depth of field set. So we've got f1.4, f1.6. My portrait work, I'm very, very heavily using shallow depth of field, small f-stop numbers, because I really like that intimacy that brings to my photos. Good example here. This is from one of our food and wine tours that we went on in the fall. And this woman is a winemaker, and she's sitting here experiencing the kind of playing with the smell of, I think these are palm fruit. I'm not positive, but she was explaining to us that she was trying to decide whether or not she was going to make this into grappa. And you'll notice the backdrop here, this background is almost completely nondescript. I mean, you can tell what it is some like texture and color and shape, and it's pleasing, but because it's non-distracting, it's pulling her focus into her. It's letting us live in this moment with her, where she is the entire center of attention on this photo. Similarly, an image like this, if we were to be up at like f16, I would see all of the texture and detail of the water behind this couple. But what I want to see instead is I want that to change into this like beautiful kind of painterly soft focus where we lose that texture and detail, but instead we've got just these lines, this banding of waves behind us. Very, very pleasing. We do need to be careful because you do run the risk of, if you were to pull focus on her forearm here, he might be out of focus. So you might need to open this up to like f1.8, f2, and play with, am I going to be able to get that soft focus on the backdrop, but still have them in focus, if that matters to you. Same thing here. We're pulling focus on this couple, allowing the backdrop to go out of focus so that we have, that quiet, intimate moment of just the two of them really magnified. So that pretty much covers Aperture. That is the creative control, which is shallow depth of field to wide depth of field. How much of my texture and detail do I want to see in my backdrops versus my subject matter? And then we've also got the functional control. How much light are we letting in? Are we opening up that aperture and really letting the light flood into the camera? Or are we narrowing it down and closing it down because we've got too much light and we want to restrict some of that? Okay, so shutter speed, part 2. So we've talked about aperture, big opening, small opening, and our second control function that allows us to control how much light comes in and out of the camera is our shutter speed, and that is the speed of our shutter. So here's how basically a camera works. We've got the front of a lens with a small or a wide aperture, got the lens barrel, and the light travels from outside through the aperture, through the lens, down the lens barrel. We have at the back our dark chamber, and we have our sensor. That's recording the light that gets all the way through here. And then somewhere in the middle, either here or here, we have a shutter. And we can think of our shutter as a literal curtain that we can open and close and decide how much light, how long that opens determines how much light enters. So our aperture is opening big or small, and our curtain or our shutter is opening a long amount of time or a short amount of time. And that is the speed at which our shutter moves. Hence the name shutter speed. It's in the name's on the tin. So that would be our shutter moving really fast or taking its time and staying open for quite some time. And just like our aperture being shown on f-stops, our shutter speed is shown as a fraction of a second. So 1/500th of a second, 1/2 of a second, 1/250th, 1/4, 1/8000th of a second. And so these 8,500, 250 maybe would be faster shutter speeds, and then 1/4, 1/2, 1 second, 2 seconds, 30 hours. Those are long shutter speeds. There is a middle ground. I'd say like 250, 500 is probably still in the middle. But once you're getting up into like 1,000, 2,000, 8,000, that's when you're starting like really fast shutter speeds. You also have to know that your camera has limits. Your shutter can only move so fast. And so some cameras, many are kind of capped at about 1/8000th of a second. Some of them are like 5,000. But most of them these days are about 8,000th of a second. On the other side, you might have limitations where it will only allow you to stay open 1 second or 2 seconds. Then there's an operation called bulb function, which is when you hold it, and as long as you keep that shutter down, it will stay open. So that one, it's kind of a software limit, but there are other things you can do. You can get a remote. You can get what's called an intervalometer, which allows you to program it and say, I want it to stay open for 30 minutes, close for 10 minutes, and then open for another 30 minutes. That's a whole thing. Okay, let's talk about the functional and the creative control options that you have for shutter speed. Functionally, it's kind of what we've a little bit already alluded to, but the longer that shutter stays open, if you leave that open for a long time, you're going to have more light entering your lens. If you have it really fast, open and then close, you're going to have less light that enters the lens. So now we have two control functions that can control how much light enters the sensor or the dark chamber in the back. Opening and closing our aperture, small, a little bit of light, wide, lots and lots of light. And then our shutter speed. Is it staying open for a long time and letting lots and lots of light pour in? Or is it quickly opening and then closing and letting just a fraction of a second come in? And then creativity. Let's take a look at some images together. So starting with our slow shutter speeds, we have some options of playing with motion and we'll say longer moments in time. So this one right here, I have a 15th of a second, which is a fairly slow shutter speed. It is allowing her, as I explained to her, to spin as fast as she can. I'm asking her to introduce motion into the frame. I'm asking her to kind of keep her face locked on me so that we see a little bit less motion on her and more motion in her arms and her waist as she's spinning. But the other thing we need to know is as we are holding a camera that has a long shutter speed, any motion that is moving around in our hands, we are going to see the backgrounds have what we call camera shake as well. So this is something we forgot to go over. Let's talk about this now. This is the only math that I'm going to make you do today, I promise. Boop. So the math that we have to think about is, what do we need to do to stop camera shake. And that math is 1 over the focal length of your lens. What does that mean? So this is a 23 millimeter lens. This is a 35 millimeter lens. This is a 50 millimeter lens. So we take that number, 1 over, say, 50 millimeters. That means we need a 1 over a 50th of a second or faster in order to make sure we're not seeing the motion from our hands on camera. So if you've got a 200 millimeter lens, you would need to be at least 200th of a second. So 1,000 is good, 100 is not. And the reason we have that is as we are holding our camera, if you've got that really long 200 millimeter lens that protrudes out, it's going to be harder to control that with your hand. The other option is really like locking your muscles and making sure that as you're looking down the lens, you are not introducing that shake as well as you can. So we will say, hold tight, lock your muscles, press it into your face, because now you have 3 points of contact on the lens, on the camera. And then as you're taking that picture, don't hit that shutter button as hard as you can. Really like softly hold that shutter down. And if you do all that, you might be able to get away with, like, on a 50 millimeter, 20th of a second. I can get away with a 15th of a second if I'm being intentional, if I'm being very calm with my motions while I'm making her do the spinning. So that's why we're seeing, though it's out of focus because of our aperture, I'm seeing the background not be fuzzy and blurred, or we're seeing that camera shake, where we just want to control that we have the motion on her and not the background. So these ones are a little bit of an advanced technique. It's kind of out of the intention of today, but in this situation here, I have fired a flash at the subject and physically spun the camera around so that we're seeing the blur of the backdrop, and I'm freezing the subject with the flash. So in this case, it was like DJ colored lights, and in this one, it is literally the like twinkly Christmas lights above. But again, we're freezing the motion with the flash, but we are spinning the actual physical camera and allowing that light to come in that kind of arced pattern. And then here, similar to the first one, I'm freezing my body and I'm asking that couple just to spin, kind of hold each other and rotate. And you'll see the motion on her, a little bit of motion on his forearm, but he was kind of being a pivot. So she was swinging around him. So he doesn't have as much motion. At a 20th of a second, I'm going to see less motion than I would at a 4th or a 15th of a second. So if this was a shorter shutter speed, I would see more blur on him and even more blur on her. But we have kind of a sliding scale, like how much speed, how much motion do you want to see in that photo? All right, so that covers aperture, big circles and little circles. That covers shutter speed, fast motion versus, or fast shutters versus slow shutters. And our third one is our most complicated. This is the one that is the trickiest to understand because there's not really a good metaphor for it. I have one that we can play with, but it's the least obvious of the three. And the third is the ISO. If you are a photographer that's been shooting for a while, or if you're a huge dork like me and you like playing with film, ISO is the same as the film speed on a film camera. So this is 800 speed film. This is 400 speed film. This is 200 speed film. And I don't care to open this. I think this is like 160. So that is the same. So 200 speed film is the same as 200 ISO on your digital camera. So 200, 200, it will basically be the same. The benefit of digital, one of the many benefits of digital, is I can just scroll a dial and I can change the ISO speed of my sensor. The only way you can do that on a film camera is if this roll isn't done, rewind it, throw away half of this roll, and put in a different roll of film. So that got really expensive if you were moving from inside to outside very frequently. on a digital camera, we have the luxury of playing with it. So what is our metaphor? How are we understanding ISO? If our aperture is a small and a big hole, the actual understanding of ISO is what we call signal to noise ratios. This is really dorky, but it is how much of the signal coming in through your camera, the light, is actually photo, your signal, and noise, which is unnecessary information. And as we increase that signal to noise ratio, we have less desirable outcomes. So the metaphor that I've figured out for this is sound. If you've got a set of speakers and you put nothing through them, but you crank that volume, you're going to hear static. You're going to hear that is quite literally just noise. That is the equivalent of the noise that we see on a photo on a high ISO sensor. As I turn that volume up, I hear that volume go up. I hear that static showing up on the speaker. If I then play music through it, I'm going to hear that static underneath the music that I'm listening to. On a lower volume, that music is going to sound clearer. It's going to feel more detail. It's not going to be as bright. It's not going to be as loud, but I will have a more clear signal, right? Same thing with your ISO. So as you crank that sensor, you turn the sensitivity up on that sensor. You go from 200 to 800 to 1600 to 3200. You're going to see more noise introduced into your photo. And that looks like random patterns of color and texture, little dots, and just less detail, less sharp photos. Let's take a look at some examples. I hope this will help clarify the understanding of this. So I've done two photos here for us. I've got a 100 ISO image and a 1500 ISO image. And this one we can see, this is something that I do a lot in my work with these like streaks of light. I really love playing with different unique textures and lighting. But there's a really good understanding here because as we zoom in, and this is just a crop on the same image, we can see a lot of really strong, beautiful detail, especially where we see his iris. There's a lot of detail in that shot. At 100 ISO, that noise, that signal to noise ratio is very low. We're not seeing a lot of that background noise that's kind of like messing up our photo. Versus 2500 ISO image. Oh, hello. This image was shot at a reception. This is like the end of the night. It's one of the last photos we shot for the night. It's fine. You can see everybody's in sharp focus. It's a nice photo. It's a little bit yellow, but here, as we crop in, you'll see it's just lacking in that detail. It's not sharp. There's some random textures and patterns in there. That is what we are giving up for rising our ISO higher and higher. So if you were to go up to like some of these modern cameras can do up to like 54,000 or like 100,000 ISO, it would be a just textured mess. They can work for, just making sure you get that photo. I'd rather see a higher ISO photo that's got a little bit of extra texture, a little bit of noise in it, than I would see you missing a shot because you're afraid that your camera can't handle it. So if you have to raise the ISO, do it. If you have the other options in front of you, and we'll get into those sometimes are a better option. Okay, I need to give you some examples of when you should be using certain ISOs. So 100 ISO would be outside. 500 ISO might be a situation like this where I've got really strong, nice window lighting, but I'm still indoors. I don't feel the need to turn on any lights inside, but I'm definitely not out in bright sun. And then something like 1600 ISO might be like inside at night with fairly bright lights. So this one would be in at day. And then anything up above that, like 3200, 6400 is going to be specialty. That's going to be really dark. That's when maybe you're shooting something that's only by candlelight, or you've got people who are keeping the lights really, really dim for for a very specific reason. Maybe you're in like a really dark barn for a wedding reception and there's only like twinkle lights above. That's when you're going to be cranking it up past like 1600 up into like 32, 64, something like that. So all of these things have their purposes. You just want to make sure that you can understand when you should be using them. All right, so we have all three pieces now. We've got our aperture, little circles and big circles. We've got our shutter speed, which is really quick moving shutters and really slow, lazy shutters that let in a lot of light. And we have our ISO. We've got cranking the sensor to increase its sensitivity and lowering it to make sure that it's clean and not as sensitive. How do we put these all together? There's like two metaphors I want to play with. One of which is something that everybody that I know who's studied photography in college or in high school learned at some time in their photography career. I don't think it's very good, and I'll explain why. And then I've got a better way that we can kind of like understand things. So let's take a look. Okay, so step one is the one that pretty much everybody learned, is the exposure triangle. And it is aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. And the reason I don't like this is because the triangle in my mind implies that as you move away, like a higher ISO means you need to drop as you raise your shutter speed, it means you drop your ISO. As you go up here, you like the idea of it like pushing and pulling, it doesn't really feel like they're balancing correctly. The only way I've thought that this kind of works is if you picture it as like a triangle that's balancing on a post, and as you're like moving here, like the other two have to move in conjunction to adjust. So instead, the way I like to think about it is we have a bucket. It's a very nice bucket. We have to fill this bucket. This bucket is our photograph, and we need to fill this bucket fully with water. And for our ISO, we can decide we need a really big bucket because it needs lots and lots and lots of light. So this would be like 100 ISO, or we can make a really small bucket, and that like 1600 ISO. It's very, very sensitive to water, if you will. Like only a little bit of water is going to fill this. Or this is 400 ISO, and this is kind of like right down the middle. So how are we filling this bucket? We have a hose, a really nice hose, and we can really have a small pinprick that's just letting a couple little drips in, or we have a really big opening that is just letting water just rush through as fast as we want. So that tiny little pinprick would be like 16 or f16. And that giant opening would be like f1.4, f2.8, something around there. So we've got our sensitivity of our sensor, our ISO, as different buckets, and the opening of the lens, or the hose, as our aperture. A small one would be f16, a really wide one would be f1.4. And then we have control of the spigot over here, and we can decide how long we want to open that. So if we just open it and shut it really quick, only a little bit of water is going to come through. And that might be okay if we've got a really small bucket and we've got a really wide opening. But if we've got a tiny little pinprick of an opening and a really big bucket, we need to open that faucet for longer, and we need to let more light kind of like pour through for a longer amount of time. So you can see as we are changing the size of the bucket or the aperture or the tap, are we opening this for longer or shorter? We need to balance the other two. We need to play with how long this is open, how big the opening is, and how big our bucket is. And if we have all three of those balanced, we can start to make a photo that feels appropriately exposed. So as we're talking about our exposure, something that's really important to know is how most cameras register or kind of share exposure information. So most cameras, when you're looking through the lens, you'll see a little diagram. It's either on up and down or along the bottom, and it will show you 0. Usually it's like -1, -2, -3. +1, +2, +3. And what this is this is showing you what it is recommending for what a good exposure is. And so we have to understand what that means a little bit, and so that we can know if we agree with the engineer that coded that. So if you're looking at a scene and the camera is seeing a really, really bright section and a really, really dark section, it is going to try to average that to the middle and balance those between them. So if you've got something crazy, crazy bright, something really, really dark, it's going to think that those two things are balanced and it's going to bring it down to 0. We might not agree with that. So maybe we want to focus on the bright part and we want to actually make it brighter. So as you're setting your settings, there's usually like a dot that comes and kind of tells you where it is along this scale. So if that dot initially shows up right at 0, like, hey, good job. You've nailed your aperture, shutter speed, and ISO, and you've made it perfect. Well, maybe we actually like the brighter part of the frame better, and we want it to be +1 or +2. So we can just raise our aperture, shutter speed, or ISO, one of them, and we can bring it up a little bit brighter, and we can decide that we want that subject matter to feel luminous or bright or full of light. Conversely, if we want to focus on that darker part of the frame, we can say, actually, I would prefer it to be -1 or -2, and that allows me to say, I want the subject matter to feel gloomy or emotional, or I don't want to say sad, but bathed in darkness. Like those words, those creative ideas are things that we play with these settings, and that's why we don't necessarily always agree with what our camera is telling us, or the designer or the engineer that made it. We get to have the control over what we want our photos to feel like. That's a pretty good understanding of all 3 functions and the way that they balance so that we understand how to use them. I have one more caveat. There's something that I believe in strongly that I talk about fairly frequently, and it's a bit controversial. Like, it's not the end of the world, but I definitely have talked to many new photographers who are just starting this craft and they're just learning all of the parts and pieces. And one of the first things that most people tell me when I ask, so where are you? Like, what have you learned? What marker are you at along this path? Many photographers will say, well, I taught myself manual, and so I'm pretty good. That is important. Don't get me wrong. The ability to operate those 3 settings at a moment's notice is very important. However, if that means that you are messing with the knobs and dials instead of talking to your client, instead of being present with your subject matter, I would almost always, your work will be worse. So how do we do that? How do we avoid that, rather? Most cameras have a setting on some sort of dial like this. Let's focus. This is manual. This is aperture priority. What that allows us to do is use this camera's supercomputer brain to do the calculations, do the math for us, because we don't want to. We want to spend our time thinking about the creative side, thinking about how we can best serve our clients, how we can make something unique and different, instead of doing the math in our head. So we'll start by setting our ISO, and that might mean I am inside with nice window lighting, so I'm sitting at around ISO 400. And then I'll set my aperture for what I want the creative to feel like. Do I want a shallow depth of field or a wide depth of field? Do I want that isolation where my subject feels intimate and I feel like they're the only one in the world? Or do I want them to feel the background around them and feel the noise of the city that they're in, for example? And then the camera does everything else. So it's going to keep your ISO where you set it. It's going to keep your shutter speed, your aperture where you set it, and it's going to do the shutter speed calculation for you. Now, when you're looking through the lens, it will show you all 3 still, and you need to keep an eye on your shutter speed and make sure that it's not dipping too low where you're going to see camera shake, or it's not going too high for some other reason that might be important to you. Or it might be going to the maximum. It might be blinking. Like, my cameras will blink at 8,000th of a second if it's too much, and that means that it won't it won't make a proper image. So it's going to be blowing out the highlights, or it's going to be too bright. So you still want to pay attention to all three, and that's why we say you still want to know what all of them do, but I don't want you to obsess over all of those parts and pieces if it means that you are going to lose the creative vision for your shoot, or that your client is going to be ignored and you're spending more time adjusting your camera than you are worrying about how your client is feeling, whether you're making an honest connection with them, whether you can tell them a story that sets them at ease, or you can listen to a story that helps them feel comfortable. That to me is endlessly more important than understanding all of the parts and pieces like a master. So I would say still learn them, but if we are instead focusing on learning the other parts of the creative craft and just knowing this well enough and getting there when we get there, I'm happy for you. That's really important to me. Okay, that's pretty much all I've got for you tonight. We went over aperture, shutter speed, ISO. We went over how to balance these three things, and we went over making sure that you are not obsessing over understanding your camera settings more than you are understanding your client. If this is your first time here, thank you. My name is Michael Kent. I am the founder and lead educator behind Photo Club. We are a holistic, community-based photography education experience designed to help people create sustainable businesses or sustainable crafts, something that you can be proud of and that can really last. This is not something splashy and one-off. We are planning on building long curriculum for people to work with. So you can expect to see, this was our Camera 101 workshop. We're going to be doing a Camera 102. Then we'll not exactly sure what all of what the numbers are going to rank out at, but I know we're going to do something like a lighting 201, lighting 202, and then maybe posing 301, posing 302. Gauging what our community needs and seeing what is important to them. So if this was valuable to you, please share it with your friends and family. Invite anybody that you think might have value in this community. You can find all of the information at ourphotoclub.co, and there's links to our social media stuff. There's links to other courses, other classes, and if you're way in the future, a fully fleshed out course for this one specifically. Thank you so much for being here. I can't believe the response to something that just a bunch of photo dorks got together and built in the equivalent of our basement. So thank you so much. And we'll see you on the next one. Bye.